Okay, everybody, here's just a quick recap of what becomes known as the decolonization movement in Africa. You can look at the maps here, and you'll see the black is the territories that are pretty much European colonies, and kind of the grayish colors, you can see where it says down the bottom left-hand corner, independent, are the countries that gained independence in the post-World War II period. As you can see, early on, 4 with a little Liberia over there, and gradually over time, 1960, 1970, and then if we were to pull up one from today, there is no European colonization in Africa at this point. So basically what happens is over the course of about 30 years, the Europeans give up their African colonies, some a little slower than others, but they're finally all gone really by the 1980s. This does not always play great for Africa, but it does happen, and now African countries are independent and can rule themselves. So just a little recap here of how this takes place and some of the key players, and then you're going to work on a Google Doc afterwards on 2 of the major players, and then there's some multiple choice at the end of it. All right, independence movements, a movement called Pan-Africanism comes into place, and this will be dealt with a little bit more heavily in the Google Doc. Also, it begins in the 1920s. The idea was it was African unity and people of African descent all over the world. Few nations achieved independence before 1945. Most got it after World War II. Many Africans had fought in the world wars. They resented returning home to second-class citizenship. Some Africans had migrated to cities during the war to work in defense industries. And they're exposed to nationalist ideas, in addition to the Atlantic Charter that I talked about in the Cold War video, signed by FDR and Churchill. Also set the goal of self-determination for all nations. Okay, the first colony really to gain independence is Ghana. It was called the Gold Coast. It was a British colony, and that movement is headed by a man named Kwame Nkrumah. He's inspired by Pan-Africanism and also by Gandhi. He used strikes and boycotts to battle the British. And in 1957, they gained their independence, and Nkrumah becomes the first prime minister. He renamed the country Ghana to link it to the great nation of the past of Mansa Musa fame. And he organizes what becomes known as the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, that promotes Pan-Africanism and really promotes the end of colonialism in Africa. It is now morphed into kind of what's called the African Union, where it's a group of African states that work together to solve the problems of Africa. All right, next up is Kenya, yet another British colony. The independence struggle is led by a man named Jomo Kenyatta. He's the spokesman for the Kikuyu tribe, who was driven off their land by the British. When some of it turned violent, the British jailed Kenyatta. He's released in '63, becomes the first independent prime minister. There's more information on Kenyatta in the Google Doc, and I believe his son is actually either the president or vice president of Kenya today. Cold War plays a big role in Africa. The Congo, the Belgian Congo, what was the Belgian Congo, right here, this big green state, became independent in 1960. The new premier asked for help in dealing with the revolt. The Soviet Union supported him against the rebels. 5 years later, an anti-communist dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko takes over the country, renaming it Zaire because of his anti-communist tests. He is propped up by the United States, allowing him to stay in power till the 1990s. That is a bad thing. He is a very bad man. He basically continues the policies of the Dutch, if you remember from when we talked about the Congo back in the imperial period. It was not a great time to be in the Congo, and continued the exploitation of the people and the resources of Congo for his own advancement. Angola, Portuguese colony, gained independence in '75 after a bloody civil war. This was really an episode in the Cold War where you had the U.S. backing one side, the Soviets backing another. That confrontation really continues until 1991 when the non-communists win because the Soviet Union has collapsed. All right, Egypt, one of the first to become independent, 1922. In 1956, a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser installs a socialist government economy. He nationalizes banks and businesses, and with the help of the Soviet Union, builds the Aswan Dam to control the flow of the Nile River, improves the amount of farmland available, and does some things with the Suez Canal also with nationalizing that, and leads to several wars there. He's the leader of many of the wars against Israel. His successor, Anwar Sadat, encourages foreign investment and free market practices. He's assassinated in 1981 after making peace with Israel. His successor, Hosni Mubarak, faced economic problems and rising population. He faces criticism from fundamentalists, eventually overthrown in 2012. And then eventually you had a brief period of democracy in Egypt, but now you're back to military rule in Egypt. Okay, so here's African independence. Ethiopia, if you remember, remained independent always, as did Liberia. And what became known as the Western Sahara was independent prior to this time frame. The rest got their independence in the back half of the 20th century. Okay, some obstacles to progress in Africa. Economic policies with the failure of socialism and mixed economies. There's a lot of cash crop agriculture as opposed to growing food, lack of funding for rural development. At the same time, you have a population explosion, which leads to widespread hunger. Political problems, you have a lot of power-hungry, greedy leaders. You have military dictators and ethnic and regional conflicts. There, you have the climate issues of too much or too little rain, tropical diseases, the desert climate, poor soil in many areas. And so they're really, Africa, until just recently, they're starting to pull away from that. There's a lot of reliance on the West for aid. Okay, some positive signs that are coming out of them. Most of the African nations have moved away from socialism to more free market economy. They're experiencing growth. Other nations have expanded mining and manufacturing and built factories to process agricultural products, so they're starting to industrialize and use the natural resources that are in Africa. And then you have an improvement in transportation and communication. This is an ongoing process in Africa. Ethnic tensions are a great deal of problem in Africa because a lot of the boundaries in Africa put groups together that had been traditional rivals, and this has caused a lot of problems with rulership and things like that. And often the loyalty to one's ethnicity is stronger than the nation because the ethnicity has been around longer than the nation, and this has caused a lot of difficulty in Africa. The most famous of these have happened in places like Nigeria, where there's a whole bunch of nations kind of thrown together, and been a lot of infighting, even up to today, where now it's more Christian and Muslim related. So a lot of problems going on in Nigeria, over here in West Africa. It's also a wealthy oil country, so you have that issue going in there. And then the most famous of the conflicts, at least the most well-known, is in Rwanda, where it's a conflict that led to genocide. Basic details here. Before 1994, Rwanda was 85% Hutu, 14% Tutsi. In 1994, Hutu extremists supported by the government officials launched a murderous campaign against the Tutsis. And according to estimates, more than 500,000 people were killed in just a few months. The genocide was stopped when a Tutsi-led rebel army seizes control of the government, and now you have a power-sharing agreement going on in there. But a lot of the problems that came out of their wars, again, the way the Belgians who owned this territory kind of played one side off against the other, and that was often the case in Africa and led to these ethnic rivalries that have caused a lot of hardship and heartache in Africa. Okay, 2002, 54 African countries formed a federation, the African Union, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, with some wonderful goals of solving economic, social, political, and environmental problems. They address the issues of desertification, the growth of the Sahara, AIDS, famine. Eventually, they plan to create an economic bloc like the European Union. they're working on controlling conflicts that spill refugees, violence, and economic destruction. This is a big problem because you still have a lot of conflict going on and a lot of people leaving and trying to migrate elsewhere. Lastly, you have the conflict in Darfur, Sudan, where Sudan is now two countries, but before then you had an Arabic north that dominated the country of the African south, and a lot of ethnic violence between them. 2 million as many as 2 million villagers became refugees. The UN was trying to get Sudan to agree to allow peacekeeping. Eventually, this has happened. And you've had a separate country now called South Sudan that is more African, and Sudan that is more the Arabic country. So it's kind of split into two countries. Okay, so that's a little bit on decolonization in Africa. Work on the Google Doc and finish up what you've got there.